Hey, this is Ina, in with you in the fight back. And today I want to talk about World War II and specifically the contrast between the Nazi and the Soviet economies at war. And this kind of relates to a question that was posted on the profile of the channel about socialism is great in theory, but does it work in practice? Now, I think if you read many of the books I've recommended on, say, the Paris Commune or the Soviet Union or China, you can have some examples of where it works in practice, or George Orwell's Homish to Catalonia for, I believe, a good example of a socialist kind of anarchist society that was working in practice. But let's look at just central planning for a moment. Central planning, one of the a major component of socialism or communism. And the bourgeoisie saying it doesn't work, it's inefficient, it's backward. And well, the thing is, the Soviet Union did win World War II, and in Europe they bore the brunt of the action. I'm not saying the United States and Britain didn't do their fair share, but let's face it, 27 million dead in the Soviet Union. They took the brunt of the action, and they were fighting against probably the most advanced industrial power in at least in Europe, which was Germany. And this is relating to a paper I wrote for a History of World War II class. And the truth is, the Soviet Union, whatever mistakes Stalin or the Stalin type system had made, it had industrialized the country. It had brought a form of modernity there, granted mixed with certain bourgeois survivals from the Tsarist period as well. And even though the Soviet Union suffered heavily in the opening days of the war, they were able to recover very rapidly, and they pretty much subordinated everything to the production of the war effort. And production was standardized and simplified through the Soviet planning system. And in many cases, skilled labor was replaced by machines. And the standardization and the simplification of Soviet planning gave it a decisive edge over their Nazi enemies. Because they were producing, say, a very few models of tanks and guns. And, for instance, the Soviets only had a few tank models, for instance, the T-34 and the KV-1, which simplifies problems of repair and maintenance. And this doesn't, because if you only have a few tanks, you don't have to produce spare parts for so many other tanks. And this is not to say there weren't technical improvements. There were in the Soviet tank designs, but the Soviets chose to improve chosen models, and the T-34, and they could really catch up to German standards fairly quickly. And by the end of 1942, remember the war in Russia started in 1941 in June, Soviet tank production was more than double the German strength, and by the autumn of 1943 it was 3 times greater. And this was very essential. A few good tank models, relatively simple maintenance, were essential to winning the war on the Eastern Front. And the Soviets they were very good in learning how to use their tanks to counter German movements in blitzkrieg, and the Soviet Union was really able to win a war of attrition. And it wasn't just winter or United States aid. A lot of their central planning and the fact that they were able to utilize what they had very effectively allowed them to win. And the Germans, on the other hand, were not able to match the Soviets in a war of attrition, despite the fact they had great resources, skilled manpower, technical expertise, and industrial capacity. The Nazis failed because they didn't centrally plan. In fact, they had all sorts of rubber stamps, bureaucratic inertia, and they didn't really use mass production. Instead, that's not to say Germany didn't produce, they did. But they weren't producing at the same rate and the same intensity as the Soviet Union. It was only really with Albert Speer, when he was brought in to kind of work on the economy, that it was really moved toward a planned economy reliant on mass production. And this would reach its height in 1944, but by that point, the odds were so against Germany, and they essentially had started planning too late, that it was over from them. And another thing the Germans did is they had some great weapons. You know, a lot of them were superior to their Soviet models, but they were expensive in skilled manpower, time, and material. And they didn't have adequate stocks of spare parts or logistical support to maintain their army. And as a result, some of these weapons, they may be great, you know, compared to the Soviet counterparts, but they're mobilized for weeks or months, and they have to, and without logistics, you can't get the few spare parts you have to use to repair these weapons. So technical skill may produce superior weapons, but it's kind of a weakness for the Germans. For instance, the Tiger tank. The Tiger tank was an enhanced weapon of the Germans, and it had great firepower, but it needed a small army of mechanics to keep it in the field. And many of these, they also had the equipment they needed, which was back in Germany, and so they needed not just mechanics, but all these spare parts that they couldn't easily get. And oftentimes, to repair the Tiger tank, they'd have to take it from the field in Russia, thousands of miles back to Germany. They didn't have the logistics there. And the Soviets, again, they had better logistics, they had simplified models, and they had effective models which they were able to improve upon. The Germans, in contrast, weren't able to match this, and when they were, it was rather too late in the game for them. But just on the area of central planning, the Soviet Union, certainly during World War II, proved how effective it could be. And the Germans, by not having central planning, showed their weakness. This is Ina. Until next time.